Hi again, everyone. Welcome again to Inside Japan. Today I'm delighted to welcome David Wagner, who is a long-term resident of Japan. He's been said to be the best crisis media trainer in Japan in English. That's been said by the Prime Minister's office here. So very lucky to have David Wagner with us here today. Thanks for coming in, David.
Good to see you. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Let's just start off. So what brings you to Japan?
Well, I first came to Japan a long time ago, in 1982. I was an exchange student in Osaka at Kansai Gaidai, and I fell in love with Japan before most people did, and I decided to stay. It's been 30 years.
Wow, it's a long time back. So that was still sort of the bubble time, wasn't it? In those days?
Yeah, I think the bubble was growing. It hadn't popped in 1989 yet, and it was interesting to be here at that time because I think in many ways, for me and my interpretation, it was really Japan's peak in the post-war period. I think since the bubble burst in 89, 90, Japan's had some challenges.
Okay, great, thanks. Maybe we can touch on that a bit later on. But before then, can you give, I know you're going back 30 years, but can you give us an idea of when you first came here, what sort of surprised you? What sort of things did you think were like really different in Japan?
Well, it's a long list. I'm sure anybody who first comes to Japan can see very superficial as well as deep differences between the place where they come from and Japan itself. What felt interesting to me was how natural it felt with the indirect communication style. And I felt that Japanese have a way of using verbal and nonverbal communication that's quite unusual. And I came to like it. Even now, 30 years later, being able to interpret accurately some of the nonverbal communication things that go on is very challenging for me. But I think the communication changes and ways in which Japanese use communication were very apparent to me, for sure.
How about in your sort of everyday life, just shopping, living, finding an apartment, that sort of...
Well, I think, as most foreigners here do, it's a joy because it's safe, it's clean. And, a city the size of Tokyo is basically what I call New York without the problems, right? It was funny, I was on the train the other day. It was about 1 in the morning on one of the last trains going back home. And this guy was completely collapsed on the train car, holding his wallet and his cell phone on top of him while he was sleeping, and nobody touched him, nobody bothered him, nobody stole his wallet, nobody took his phone. Anywhere else in the world, it's all gone, and probably he would have had a rough time. That's the thing I love about Japan, I really do. It's easy. It's a big city without big city problems.
And again, during the earthquake last year, I think a lot of people around the world were just amazed at how people were just queuing up and everything was very orderly and so on.
Yeah, what surprised me about that is that the rest of the world look at Japan in amazement when in fact what I think Japan is a normal society. That's the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be orderly. It's supposed to be wait your turn. And much of the world is not that way. So that's another thing I love about Japan.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, David, can you give, you've been here 30 years. What's your sort of focus at the moment? What keeps you here in Japan?
Sure. Like most people, work. I've been a trainer for 30 years, and I spent most of that time doing business communication training, which was, I'd say, 99% helping Japanese to do business with people like you and me. And about 12, 13 years ago, I changed my focus a little bit more toward media and crisis communications. I became very interested in how messages are used to influence and persuade. And now what I do most of the time is help executives, CEOs, ambassadors, government officials to get their messages across in ways that persuade other people. So it's challenging. Every day is different, and I enjoy it very much.
On that note, I know, we were kind of going through some questions before this, but so this isn't actually on the list, but I'm just wondering what's your sort of assessment on the way the earthquake was kind of handled by the government and TEPCO officials and so on in terms of kind of media?
Well, I think it's well documented now, well over a year after the crisis, what went well and what didn't go so well. I think at this point, what's important to focus on is that the lessons were learned and that those in positions of power to make critical decisions, should this happen again, can do so in a more forthright and transparent way. I think that's the key message there. Yeah.
I think one thing that just kind of living here and as a kind of person watching TV to get source of information, one thing that I hated about that, the way it was handled, was all the officials looked so calm and, you know, and I'm kind of thinking we're all panicking here, and you know, at least they could show that they're a bit kind of panicky or agitated, but they all look so calm and controlled. And
well, I was advising some top officials involved in that process. I can't name names, but more than what was shown visually, I think, was the verbal messaging was not, I think, to the satisfaction of many people. Some people were quite good, but it's interesting. I think most people who are in positions as spokespersons are not properly trained on how to deliver messages, as well as how to make the messages so that they're right on target to meet target audiences and target needs. So. Rather than see somebody get excited and panicked, you don't want that in a crisis. You don't want somebody to seem like they're out of control. So I think we're coming back to communication again. We're coming back to the indirect style in which Japanese tend to communicate. The challenge, I think, for many spokespersons is when you're speaking in Japanese versus speaking in English, it's a big difference. Because English is a direct language and Japanese is an indirect language. And to use an indirect style in English in a crisis is probably not going to be effective.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Interesting.
Sure.
So, I mean, you're originally from America.
Denver, Colorado.
Denver, Colorado. Okay.
Rocky Mountains.
Okay. Great part of the US of A.
Yeah. Actually, Pak-kun, the famous NHK guy, is also from Colorado.
Oh, I see.
Right. He's our most famous son.
I see.
Yeah.
Interesting. How would you compare? I know it's kind of high level, but in terms of comparing the American kind of way of doing business and sort of Japanese way of doing business. I know you've talked about communication style and so on, but how else could you kind of compare the two?
I think there's strengths on both sides. I clearly think Japanese have strengths in the way they do business, and so do Americans, if we're talking about those two cultures, because I consider myself to be bicultural at this point. I've lived most of my adult life here, but I was raised in the United States. What I'd like to see, actually, is Japanese become a bit more direct and Americans become a bit more indirect. I think they could learn from each other. Japanese need to become clearer in expectations and transparency, again, that word is used, in what they want from a relationship and how they want business to be done instead of the assumption world. Because I think Japanese are often in what I call the omoikomi sekai, the land of assumptions. And that's really dangerous for clarity. I think Americans also would be more served in dealing with Japanese by being a bit more patient and being a bit more focused on the group relationship instead of the individual relationship. Because clearly America's individual-oriented, Japan is group-oriented. And I think if doing business and focusing on the long-term relationship, if Americans do that with Japanese, I think they'll be more successful. For many Japanese I train, they see a foreigner who comes and works, let's say here in Tokyo or in Osaka, and they know that person's probably here less than 5 years, whereas they know that they're going to be here long term, right? And so I've seen many instances in my training times at embassies or in the private sector where they know in 1 or 2 years this person is gone, and they don't really want to make an effort to develop a long-term relationship with that person. But if you do make that effort, it's a lifelong relationship. Japanese will respond very, effectively, for sure.
You must have seen a lot of foreigners or non-Japanese coming here and just making a complete mess of, trying to live and work with, Japanese in kind of business context.
Sure.
Could you share sort of a memory on it?
I have an interesting one. It just came to my head. I've been doing a lot of training also for expatriates who come from overseas and come to live in Japan, mainly Canadians and Americans, but sometimes Europeans, and sometimes actually Chinese. And I'm reminded of an instance where there was a huge American corporation, I can't name the name. They had a joint venture going on here, and they brought somebody in. It was a new joint venture. And we spent 3 hours talking about where his office was located inside the particular space that they were using, because the Japanese partner wanted this person to be in the center of the office, And headquarters back in the US wanted him to be next to the president and the chairman. And I spent 3 hours talking about the pros and cons and the dynamics of why that decision was probably made. And it's very interesting because when expatriates come here, they're here for a short time. They have to really meet the needs of headquarters, HQ, because that's who pays their bills. And so what happens is the expectations of HQ are sometimes unrealistic in what can be achieved in the amount of time that the person has. So they have to make it work on the ground here, but they're squeezed from the top, maybe financially or even in terms of getting performance levels. And generally what I find the expats do is they listen to HQ, they don't listen to what's going on the ground. And I've seen that be an obstacle sometimes.
I wonder if
a great
the same,
challenge.
Yeah, the same could be said of Japanese expats abroad as well.
Yep, I've seen that too. And I actually don't know of many instances in my own work where Japanese have gone overseas and stayed the same amount of time and achieved the same amount of goals. I think both sides are challenged from that perspective. You're probably right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you've been here about over 30 years.
Yeah.
How's Japan changed over that 3 decades?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I say that meaning the whole concept of kokusaika, which is internationalization, I think was the basis for why Japan should move overseas in the late 80s and the 90s. It was more or less a fait accompli because they had to do it anyway for business. But I think what's changed is now the need is much greater. We see in some sectors the hollowing out of industry. We see the diminished capacity of electricity production and creation right now because of what's happened in Fukushima. I also see a greater number of foreigners coming here than ever before. Maybe in the last year during the crisis a lot left, but the numbers are back to where they were before from everything I read. And I think the biggest thing I've seen change is 20, 30 years ago, Japanese, I felt, were more willing and interested to look outside for the future. And even though the need is greater now, my experience is that most Japanese are not looking outside as much as they should be. And I don't know why. I haven't been able to figure that out, but it's interesting. There are a lot of education programs that are helping to train and teach Japanese executives to go overseas, and they're successful because Japanese companies have to do it now, whereas 20 or 30 years ago, it was just a choice. The Japanese market is shrinking. The population targets for the year 2100 are going from 127 million now to 48 million within less than 100 years. And that means dramatic problems for Japan in terms of everything from who's going to be running the companies, how they're going to get the talent they need to run the companies, how they're going to pay for the pensions and how they're going to pay for taxes, who's going to clean the streets. I think Japan is in for a dramatic change. And I think they have to make immigration policies that are more in line with what the future requires. I think they're doing that. The extension visas now are up to 5 years. But if you compare it to Singapore, and I know because I've done a lot of business in Singapore, it's so easy to start a business in Singapore. It's so easy to get a visa in Singapore. And I'm a permanent resident in Japan now, right? I've been here over 10 consecutive years. Why does it take 10 years to get permanent resident status, whereas in Singapore you can do it in just over a year? It's fascinating to me. Those kinds of things need to be more user-friendly if they want to attract the kind of talent that I think needs to come here.